everyone. My name is Nicole Jacque. We've had an exciting development for FIP treatment here in the United States, the availability of compounded GS 441524 that can be prescribed by veterinarians. Today, I'm going to explain how this works and how it compares with other pathways for legal FIP treatment in the United States. In the last few days, there's been a really exciting announcement, and people in the FIP community and vet community are really excited. Starting June 1st, Stokes Pharmacy will be making compounded GS 441524 available in the United States through GFI 256. This is a huge step in the right direction, and it puts treatment back in the hands of veterinarians, where it belongs. Understandably, though, this has prompted some questions and confusion. I've had lots of people reaching out to me asking things like, how does this work? Does this mean the FDA has approved GS? The answer takes a bit of explanation. So let's start by talking about the various ways in which veterinary medication can be legally prescribed and used in the United States. In the US, there are several ways in which a medication can be prescribed by veterinarians, and as it turns out, there are FIP treatment options that are exercising each one. The first way is for a company to go through the process of getting FDA approval for their drug. This means the company is able to prove efficacy, safety, and the ability to manufacture the drug at scale at a quality level that meets FDA standards. Secondly, if a drug has been approved for human use, a veterinarian can prescribe it off-label. And in fact, many common veterinary drugs are prescribed this way, as there's just not FDA-approved drugs for every specific animal and medical condition. Finally, sometimes there are situations where a drug is needed either instead of or in the absence of an FDA-approved drug. The FDA understands that, especially in veterinary medicine, there are many cases where this is necessary and has provided guidelines that will allow veterinarians to prescribe unapproved drugs under specific circumstances. So first, let's talk about FDA approval. There is one FIP treatment drug which is currently in the pipeline working towards FDA approval, GC376. This protease inhibitor was the first antiviral trialed successfully for FIP by Niels Peterson and was originally developed at Kansas State. A veterinary pharmaceutical company, Anaviv, has licensed GC376 and has been working through the process of FDA approval. Because of the lack of other approved drugs for FIP, as well as ample study data on safety and efficacy, the FDA has fast-tracked this approval, and it's estimated to be ready for market in 2025. Next, let's talk about off-label prescription of a drug approved for humans. Remdesivir, marketed under the name Veklury, is a drug that can be prescribed for FIP under this circumstance. It was approved in October 2020 to treat COVID in humans, and since then it has been legal to prescribe for FIP under the extra label drug use regulations in 21 CFR Part 530. This hasn't been used so much in the US so far, partially due to some confusion. While it was FDA approved to treat COVID in humans 12 and over, it was still listed in many places as emergency authorization only, due to pending authorization for use in patients under 12. Also, it was particularly difficult to access due to both COVID and a lack of veterinary channel distribution. It's a rather expensive medication, and it's only available as an injectable, which means it may not be suitable for some cats and may make it very difficult for owners to comply with the treatment protocol. So it works, but it's very difficult for vets to obtain, and it's limited in the ways it can be administered. Now, let's talk about what I'm sure you're all interested in hearing about: prescription of a compounded, unapproved drug under GFI 256, which is how we are getting access to GS 441524. In the US, GS 441524 will be compounded and available for prescription through Stokes Pharmacy. Stokes is partnering with Bova, a pharmacy which has been providing compounded GS in Australia and the UK for a while now, under a similar regulatory path known as the veterinary cascade. All right, so what is GFI 256? GFI stands for Guidance for Industry, and it lays out a set of rules for vets and pharmacies to allow them to use compounded drugs to solve problems when there's not an appropriate approved drug. In essence, although it explains that the preference should be to use a specifically approved drug when available, the FDA understands that sometimes that's not possible or appropriate, and that compounding an unapproved drug, i.e., from bulk drug substances, can be medically appropriate. There are some rules that must be followed to do this. For example, it must be compounded by a licensed pharmacist or veterinarian and then directly dispensed to the owner or patient or to the treating veterinarian. It cannot be resold or go through distributors. The compounding pharmacy must adhere to a number of FDA regulations about how the compounding is done, registration of facilities where it's done, and so on. Prescriptions must be made by a licensed veterinarian with a valid vet-client-patient relationship. The compounded drug cannot be ordered for office stock. It must be prescribed on an individual basis. However, there is a special list that a drug can be nominated for to allow this, the List of Bulk Drug Substances for Compounding Office Stock Drugs for Use in Non-Food Producing Animals. And I'm happy to say GS has been nominated. And finally, a medical reason for the prescription must be documented. All right, now this may have you thinking, what do they mean by that? Is that going to be difficult? But it's actually a very reasonable and easy to satisfy requirement. The key thing to remember here is that the FDA is not going to argue with a vet about their reasoning as long as it's documented and has a medical or practical basis. So, for example, these are some medical reasons which the FDA will accept. A patient has allergies, a particular product that is approved is toxic to the species, the patient would require too many tablets of another product, the dose that is needed requires a fraction of the approved tablet that you just can't accomplish. A patient cannot safely be pilled with the approved capsule. One thing of note for these last few, the FDA is really leaving it to the veterinarian to make a medical assessment of what is reasonable for the patient. The FDA has explicitly said they don't intend to question the veterinarian's determination about what is reasonable. Also, notice these are all just one sentence. This is about the extent of the documentation needed. You don't have to write a novel here. Now, here are some examples of reasons the FDA will not accept. The compounded drug is less expensive. That's a financial reason, not a medical reason, so that's not acceptable. You prefer a particular compounded drug or a compounder, again, not a medical reason. Now, need half strength. By itself, this wouldn't work. It's missing a medical rationale. But if you expand on it to explain, like, need half strength to reduce irritation upon application, this is perfectly valid. All right, so this all seems very reasonable. But vets, if you're still concerned, when you prescribe GS via iFill, it will prompt you for the information. Also, pharmacists are prepared to help veterinarians with a statement if you call the prescription in via phone. Stokes has a lot of experience with this sort of compounding, and they'll help you make sure that your prescriptions comply with the FDA requirements. So as you can see, this really isn't a very difficult requirement, and it's really easy to comply with this part of the FDA requirements. All right, it all sounds great, right? But lots of people are asking me, okay, but so the FDA is fine with this, but what about Gilead? So there's an aspect of patent law here, but this is actually not a super uncommon situation in the pharmacy industry. And it's actually quite rare for a pharmaceutical company to take action against a compounding pharmacy, partially because the government provides some exemptions for compounders. It's in the public interest that patents should not prevent access to needed medications. In addition, Gilead has been consulted by Stokes and Bova, and although they have not formally licensed or agreed to anything on paper, they have verbally conveyed that they will allow this to happen, knowing that Bova did extensive research on the formulation and had several clinical studies that used it. Plus, Stokes worked with Bova for more than a year to produce the exact same formula that was used in those studies. Realistically, Gilead just isn't interested in the veterinary market. It's a minuscule slice of the pie compared to the human pharmaceutical market, and they're not going to enter it. But they've indicated they won't stand in the way of this compounding usage. In a few years, the patent on GS will expire, and then the patent issue will disappear altogether. All right, I hope I've answered some of your questions and cleared up how this all works. If you have any questions about any of this, please feel free to reach out to me at Nicole at FIPglobalcats.com.